Good morning. I'm Johanna Derlega, publisher of The Hill. Welcome to this morning's discussion, Main Street Matters, Jobs, Wages, and the Small Business Economy. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Paychex, for making the event possible. We are delighted to be gathering during National Small Business Week to talk about small firms and neighborhood businesses that are key to the health of the U.S. economy. How can their entrepreneurship be better supported, and what matters most to those who keep Main Street open for business? This morning we'll hear from congressional leaders, economists, and small business owners about job creation, wages, and the policies that have an impact on their small firms. Just before we get started, a few notes of housekeeping. In addition to those of you in the studio, we are live streaming on thehill.com. We ask that you keep your phones on silent, but please do join the conversation. On social media, you can follow us on Twitter at The Hill Events, and you can also comment using the hashtag MainStreet2017. We're going to be taking questions throughout the program, and so keep an eye out for members of our team with handheld mics. Finally, there is a short survey on your seats, and we would love any feedback you have, so feel free to fill that out at the end of the program. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We begin this morning with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. She's the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Senator Shaheen also happens to be a former small business owner. Welcome, Senator. And joining her is my colleague, The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Johanna. Senator, I want to talk about, first anecdotally, tell us about when you were a small business owner and what you learned from being a small business owner and taking those lessons to Washington.
Well, when my husband and I first got married, we had a small seasonal retail business at the beach. And, you know, it was 100 days, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And I learned a lot from that experience. I learned how the challenges that small business owners face with regulation and with meeting a payroll and with making sure that you provide customer service and put out a good product. So it was a very important learning experience, and that small business put us both through graduate school and gave us a down payment on a house. So it also, for me, was about the opportunities that exist with small businesses.
In your state, you and Senator Risch wrote a bipartisan op-ed, imagine that, bipartisanship. More than 99% of employers in New Hampshire are small businesses. That's astounding.
It is. They employ just over 50% of all workers in New Hampshire. And, you know, small businesses throughout the country create about 2/3 of all jobs. They produce 16 times more patents per employee than large businesses. And so there's a lot of innovation also that goes on in small businesses.
How do you define a small business? What is the threshold? Because different people seem to have different definitions. Well,
I think that 99% is businesses with under 100 employees in New Hampshire. Okay. So when we talk about it in that context.
Can you describe the agenda for the Small Business Committee? What can the committee do that would help?
You know, we're looking at the challenges that small businesses face. So as I travel around New Hampshire these days, where our unemployment rate is 2.3%, what I hear from small business owners is the challenge of finding skilled workers. So they can't find the workers that they need for the jobs that they have. Access to capital is a huge challenge for small businesses. Regulation, you know, unlike large businesses where you can hire somebody to do the regulations, most small businesses don't have that luxury, particularly businesses with fewer than 10 employees. So they want regulations that are simple, that they can understand. Access to health care is a big challenge for small businesses. And of course, other benefits that, as I said, with this kind of an environment where it's hard to find workers, benefits are a big part of what keeps workers at a business. And so thinking about how they can provide those kinds of benefits. I was at a company in New Hampshire called AdMix that makes mixing components, like big, you know, huge. And one of the things that the employees there told me was the best thing about the business was they have this 980 schedule. So every so many weeks they get a Friday off, and they work longer hours some of the other days. And what a great benefit. I asked, what's the favorite thing that you have about the job here? And that was number one for most of the employees.
What do you, not a bipartisan issue, the Affordable Care Act, what do you hear about that? That is, as you know, a partisan battle going on now. They may vote on the House this week on it. What do you hear from small businesses about Obamacare?
Most small businesses want to provide health care for their employees. They understand how important it is. They understand that it's one of the things that keeps people productive if they don't have to worry about health care for themselves and their families. But the challenge is the cost. And there are things that need to be fixed about the Affordable Care Act. I think it's been working, but like any other major change in a program, it needs changes to address what we've learned about how it's working. And we need people to work together to do that. And I'm hopeful that once we get through all of the machinations that are going on, that we will see people actually come together and try and make some of the changes that we need to make in order to ensure that people in this country have health care, because that is fundamental. It's fundamental to everybody, and the idea that we're going to deny you health insurance if you have a pre-existing condition is just not something that people can live with.
So you're hopeful that you're seeing a process where Republicans struggle to pass what they're trying to pass, repeal and replace. Do you think, how long will that be before the parties come together on something like Obamacare?
I don't know. I know it's possible, though. The only bipartisan change to the Affordable Care Act is one that I worked on with Tim Scott from South Carolina, and it allows states to determine whether they want to go up in group size from 50 to 100 in terms of coverage of the Affordable Care Act. And we got that through both houses by unanimous consent. So people understand there are changes we can make to improve the law, and we should do that, working together.
Going back to regulations, are there regulations that are on the books that should be eradicated? And how do you think the past administration, the Obama administration, what their agenda on small business could the president have done something better for small businesses?
I feel like you can always do better. It doesn't matter what you do, there's always a way to do it better. And that's what we need to look at, what we can do to simplify some of the regulations. I mean, one of the biggest challenges small business have is with our tax system. I've actually proposed legislation, hasn't gone anywhere, but not for small businesses, but for individuals to simplify the way we file our tax returns, because the IRS has all the information. They could give it back to us. We could look at it each year and say, this has changed and it's fine, and file it electronically and avoid all of the last minute rush. But so far, people haven't been willing to do that.
From where Republicans are headed on tax reform and the president's proposal last week, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of details, but what I have seen makes me concerned that it's not what small businesses need as they're looking at their taxes. I think most of us believe that our corporate tax rate is too high, but also that the loopholes that we have that allow certain large corporations in particular to avoid paying their taxes, we also have too many of those. And it's not fair for a large corporation to avoid paying almost all of their taxes when we have small businesses on Main Street who work hard, who try and follow the rules, who pay their taxes, and they see this disparity and think it's not fair, and it's not fair.
Where do you see, just overall, the Trump agenda and also SBA? What can SBA do? You voted in favor of Linda McMahon, head of SBA. Where do you think SBA goes, and are you heartened by her leading that agency?
I'm very pleased with Linda McMahon. I think she's passionate about small business. She has a great personal success story in terms of what she and her husband were able to do with their business experience in wrestling. And she has been very responsive. And one of the things that I think we need to do on the Small Business Committee is to think about policy changes that we can enact that support small businesses. So I talked about AdMix, this company in New Hampshire. It has a little over 50 employees. One of the things they're trying to do now is to get into international markets. And they have benefited from the STEP program, which is one of the programs that we were able to get in to help small businesses with exporting, provides grants to states. And so they're able to go be at a trade show where they can advertise because they were able to get that STEP grant. I visited a business called Costa Precision Manufacturing, it's a mouthful, that does precision machining. And they just got qualified as a HUB zone, historically underutilized business, which is a designation from SBA that allows them to take advantage of government contracting. Well, there are about 600 companies in the country or 200, I'm sorry, that do this kind of precision manufacturing that Costa does with the certifications. When you factor in who's got that HUB zone designation, there are only 6 companies in the country. And so it dramatically increases their ability to compete for those government contracts. So those are the kinds of things that we can do through the SBA that can help small businesses. In addition to lending, most people are familiar with the lending programs through the SBA, the 7A program, the 504 lending program. I talked about access to credit, which is a continuing issue for small businesses. That's one thing that they can do to help them as they're looking for credit.
Has that access to credit gotten a little better over the last few years?
You know, it's gotten better, but it's not. Small businesses are not doing as well as large businesses are. So after the financial meltdown, we've seen big business recover, but we're still watching small businesses that continue to struggle with that access to capital.
At the state level, what resources help small businesses?
You know, there are a couple of things that we have found in New Hampshire are very important. And I served as governor, so I've seen it both from the state side as well as the federal side. One thing is being able to talk to somebody about whatever your issue is. So the fact that you can call and actually talk to a real person and get information easily and clearly about how to start a business, about what the regulations are, that's really important. Certainty is really important for small businesses. It's important for all businesses, actually, but the fact that we have had difficulties with budget agreements in Washington really creates uncertainty for business in a way that's challenging as they're thinking about their planning and their sales, what they need to do. So providing that certainty is also very important.
So when Washington has bitter disputes on the budget, or later this year, the Congress is going to be tasked with raising the debt ceiling, that causes a lot of angst for small business owners?
A tremendous amount of angst. And, you know, when we were, if you remember back in 2011.
That was pretty nasty. Yeah.
There was a long period of uncertainty before we finally got the Budget Control Act. And I visited a number of businesses in New Hampshire who talked about their product piling up in warehouses because they were waiting to figure out what was going to happen, and they weren't able to go forward. So that's very challenging.
As you know, partisanship is alive and well in Washington. Do you have any, are you an optimist that eventually it's going to break, that the parties, I mean, if you look at, and talking to Democrats over the first 100 days, they say, well, listen, we were willing to work on a transportation bill, we haven't seen that. So there has been kind of a partisan tone that's been set by this administration, and it's similar to what Republicans said when Obama took over. And he had both, just like President Trump has majorities in the House and Senate. Will gridlock ever disappear in this town?
Well, I think most politicians are pretty optimistic. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this. So I am optimistic, and there are areas. A number of the committees that I work on are very bipartisan. The Small Business Committee, Senator Risch, who is from Idaho, who chairs the committee, and I'm the ranking member. We work very closely together. We have very different political views, but when it comes to small business, to the mission of the committee, we work closely and I think very well together. The same is true on the Armed Services Committee, which I also serve on, and the Appropriations Committee. Despite what many people see, there's a lot of agreement on the Appropriations Committee. So I think there are pockets of bipartisanship, and what we need to do is to build on those and try and work together. And if we could only limit campaigns to a shorter period of time, there would be less spillover in terms of partisanship.
As far as how the committee works, do you try to stay away, and Chairman Risch, from those hot button issues that you're just not going to agree on, and focus on possible areas of agreement?
I don't think so. We haven't been working together that long in this position, since we're only 4 months in now to the new Congress. But we have some different views on regulation, for example, and we're going forward with a hearing on that. So I think as long as we can talk to each other and appreciate each other's points of view, that's the important thing. And there are going to be differences of opinion, but the important thing is to be able to compromise, to be able to figure out how we go forward.
We are going to take questions toward the end in about a few minutes, so if you can think of some questions for the Senator. Going back to regulations, most people in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, haven't been a small business owner. And in Washington, regulations, I think, are kind of viewed as the black and white of Democrats are pro-regulation, Republicans are anti-regulations. But being a small business owner, how does that help you in educating maybe some of your Democratic colleagues of, well, there is some red tape here, there are some problems that we encounter? Do you have those discussions with your Democratic colleagues?
We do, and there are differences of opinion in the Democratic caucus about to what extent regulations are good or not good, but there's also agreement. I was up at a business when I was home in New Hampshire a couple of weeks ago, Pete and Jerry's organic eggs. They sell them in Washington, and people here may have bought Pete and Jerry's. And they've really built a great business on organic, non-GMO egg business. And so those regulations in that arena have been really good for their business. So, we can't put all regulations in the same pot. I think most of us like clean air and clean water. That was done through regulation, through the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. And so we have to distinguish between regulations that are helpful to people and regulations that are there just for regulation's sake. And I think that's what people object to.
In the first 100 days, there have been regulations Obama-era regulations that have been eradicated under President Trump. Did you support those efforts?
I did not support repealing back those, what they're called the CRAs.
We only need a majority
Right.
to get rid of the regulation.
We're gonna vote on one this week, I think, that would prohibit states from being able to set up retirement systems, states and municipalities. And this is a regulation that costs no money to the federal government. It creates no problem federally. It just gives the states and cities the ability to set up independent retirement opportunities for people who may not have pensions or be looking at a secure retirement. Now, in my mind, it doesn't make sense to repeal that kind of a regulation. Why do we want to regulate what states can do in that arena?
What do you think of President Trump's outlook for regulations? One of his big mantras is, we're going to get rid of 2 regulations for every new regulation. Do you think that's a good model?
I don't think an arbitrary number like that makes sense. I think what makes more sense is to look at what works and what doesn't work, and to think about it from that perspective.
We'll take some questions from the audience. If you can, we have people with microphones, and if you can just identify yourself and ask your question to the Senator. It's a shy group. We've got
They're not
coffee
awake
here.
yet.
The one up in the front.
Yes. Excuse me. Good morning, Senator. Thanks for being here. Happy National Small Business Week. I'm John Bird with the Coalition on the White House Conference on Small Business. There have been three, Carter in 80, Reagan in 86, and Clinton in 95. It's an opportunity to bring small business to D.C. and start with the state, move on to regional conferences, and then finally at the White House level. Can you explain any kind of opportunities the committee is taking a look at moving this forward in this term of the Trump administration, having actually the next version of a White House conference on small business?
Boy, that's a really good question, and I don't know of any, but it would be something that we should encourage, and I would think that the Small Business Committee might be able to suggest to the president that that would be a great thing to do, and we would like to participate in it. So thank you for raising it.
One question about the national minimum wage. Small business groups in Washington have lobbied against it, saying if you raise it to $12 or $15 or higher, small businesses, basically, you'd lose jobs in this country. Where do you stand on that, and what do you think of that argument?
You know, I think there's a difference of opinion among small business groups. I've talked to small business groups who oppose raising the minimum wage and those who support raising it. I personally support raising the minimum wage, and for most businesses in New Hampshire, they have a higher than national average minimum wage, even though we have no designated state minimum wage in New Hampshire. But because we have the low unemployment rate, most employers have figured out that if they want to keep their employees, they've got to pay them more. And it's important to make sure that people can make a living when they're working. And unfortunately, at the rate of our minimum wage today, people can't make a living.
Do you think that's something that could happen in the Trump administration? The president has indicated at times that he could be interested in striking some deal with Democrats on that.
I hope so. I think that's a place where we could work together, certainly.
More questions from the audience? Right there.
I have a question about what the SBA does with individual states to
Okay, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. My name's Lisa Sanders, and I'm a small business person, entrepreneur. I do business-to-business public relations, and one of my clients works with a state to to encourage location of businesses in that particular state. So I have a question about what the SBA does working with states to encourage businesses to locate in a particular state. Like, is there any kind of partnership that you guys do? Is that an area of interest or activity?
That's very much based on the states, I think. I believe we want to encourage that, and in New Hampshire, both now and when I was governor, and I think governors since, have tried to work very closely with SBA. We have a state director who I just visited a number of small businesses on Monday in honor of Small Business Week, and the state director was there. The head of our small business development centers was there, all to meet with this great small business called Pops Up that makes popcorn, non-GMO popcorn. So we have a very close relationship with SBA, and I think that's true of many states. Sometimes it may be harder in large states to have that kind of working relationship, but usually often when we're talking to companies that are facing challenges, we want to get the SBA involved because they have such great resources. Not only is there access to loan programs, but also there's counseling services, both through the small business development centers, through something called the SCORE program, where people who have been successful in business serve as volunteer mentors for business owners. There are women's business centers that help women-owned businesses. There are veteran programs to help veterans who are trying to set up their own businesses. So there are tremendous supports there for people in business, and often the challenge is making sure they know about them.
Right over here.
Hi, Senator John Arnsmeyer, Small Business Majority. Good to see you again. You
John
talked about
has
it.
testified before the Small Business Committee.
You've talked about access to capital, and there's obviously been a proliferation of alternative non-bank lending out there. And we actually see this as a potential opportunity for additional capital in the hands of small business, but it's got kind of a Wild West feel to it. There's a lot of predatory lending going on. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how we could possibly move this forward, but also do it in a way that encourages responsible lending.
I think that would be a great topic for a hearing, John.
You could testify.
So we could bring people in. I actually don't know enough about the details of what's going on out there, and that's why it would really be great to bring people in and find out. I agree that there are some real opportunities there, but we've also seen some abuses, so it would be great to think about how we can make sure that it's responsible lending that's going on. Good, thank you.
You mentioned you're an optimist about stuff that's going on in Washington. Have you noticed that small businesses have gotten more optimistic? We've seen kind of conflicting numbers on the economy. So it's kind of good news, and then we get bad news. What's the feeling outside the Washington Beltway?
Well, for the businesses that I've visited, people have generally been optimistic. They're looking, but it's based very much on the bottom line. If you're doing well, if you're seeing your revenues tick up, if you're looking at opportunities, then you're optimistic. If you've got challenges, then it's harder to be optimistic. And fortunately, as I said, we've experienced, I forget how many months now, of job increases and improvement in the economy, and while it may not be as, the percentage of growth may not be as robust as people would like, it's still steadily improving, and that's a very good sign. And it's a good sign for business climate in general, and particularly for small businesses.
We are out of time. Please thank the senator. A great discussion this morning.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Senator. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Senator. Bob is staying back for our next conversation this morning. I'd like to now call on Congressman Steve Chabot, Chairman of the House Small Business Committee. He has been serving on this committee since he was elected in 1994. Welcome, Chairman. Bob, back over to you.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. How are you?
Good to see you. How you doing? Thank you.
So I was looking at that you have served on the Small Business Committee since 1994.
Yep, I
That's
have.
remarkable. How has small business changed?
I love it, by the way.
Do
So,
you?
yeah.
It's not like a sentence.
That's right, it's not.
How has small business changed over those decades?
It's the most significant, I believe, part of the economy, and our role really is to listen to small businesses all across the country and try to work towards policies which make their lives a little better. Unfortunately, a lot that comes out of Washington just makes life harder for them, and hopefully we're going to move in the right direction this time. I especially like President Trump's new drive towards getting rid of 2 regulations for every new one.
You like that?
I do
Yeah,
a
yeah.
lot because over-regulation is one of the big problems that small businesses face all across the country. So as far as changing, hopefully we'll make some movement in the right direction.
Is that the number one issue you hear from small business owners about Washington regulations?
I would say yes. I mean, we hear a lot about health care and taxes and things of that nature, but I have to say over-regulation, red tape, which they use that term a lot, which is basically the same thing, is, I'd say, the number one complaint that I hear.
And looking forward for this Congress and this year, what's the agenda for the Small Business Committee?
Well, the agenda is a number of things. It's number one, I think, repealing and replacing Obamacare, which has been called the mother of all regulations. We may make a big step towards doing that this week, maybe tomorrow, maybe not. We don't know. It's been a challenging thing to do, as we know.
Do you like the changes to the bill? Do you think it would solve the problem?
Yeah, I probably would have supported the previous bill, and if we can move it in a more conservative direction, personally, I like that. But what we can do to get 218 or 216 or whatever it is now that we have a number of members out, is what we need to do, because the American people deserve better than what they're getting right now under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, whichever terminology one prefers.
what do small businesses say about the Affordable Care Act? What is their complaint about it that you think this bill would give them relief?
With a few exceptions, I hear complaints about a whole range of things. The cost of it is the principal complaint, I would say. It just costs too darn much. The people were promised that rates were going to come down by the figure that the previous president had given was $2,500, and we've seen really just the opposite. You can keep your doctor, all the complaints that we've heard. And small businesses are dealing with their employees as well as themselves, because generally the owner is working there as well and has to support his or her family. So it's just the cost of it is the principal thing, but it's also the complexity of it. And as I say, the American people deserve better, and small business folks, I think, they're probably the principal people, I think, in this country that recognize that.
As you know, the first health care bill, repeal and replace, was pulled from the House floor. Changes have since been made. The mood of the House Republican Conference, is it better, more getting there, united on Obamacare than it had been a little while back?
Yeah, I think for the most part, you've got, of course, we got the Freedom Caucus on the right. We have the Tuesday group that's more moderate, one might say on the left, and then you've got the vast majority who's sort of in the middle. And we're working together, but we're not there yet. I hope we're there by tomorrow, or if not tomorrow, in the very near future. But I'd say the overall attitude, I think, is positive. And the bottom line is, if there's one thing that Republicans promised over the last number of years, it was that we would repeal and replace Obamacare. And we need to do that. We need to meet our commitment on that. And the American people, as I say, deserve better than they're getting now.
So if it's, at first there was kind of an artificial deadline that was set up that it seemed like, in retrospect, didn't make much sense because, as you said, you campaigned on it, every Republican campaigned on it. So if you don't get it this week, then when you come back after the recess, then you do it?
I think in theory that's right, but in reality, Bob, you've been around a while, you know how Congress works. If you don't set a deadline, people will whip undecided or leans this way or that way and don't want to commit, and they're also angling to try to make the bill better. And this is a bigger piece of legislation than most that we deal with. So I think if you didn't have that deadline, we just would have delayed and delayed and delayed, kicking. I mean, look at all the CRs we have, kind of putting off tough decisions till down the road. Now, since we didn't have the vote and fail and then lose reconciliation, it wasn't a disaster, although it was very embarrassing. I mean, when you can repeal this bad legislation, I think, that being Obamacare, 50 or 60 times when it doesn't really matter, because the president ultimately would veto if it got to this desk. And the one time it got to his desk, he did that. That's right. Now we're shooting with real bullets, and there's no excuse, as far as I'm concerned, for not getting the job done. We need to do it.
Is this all hands on deck? Are you talking to members, trying to get them to yes?
I think we all are. Okay. Although, we've had a few defections as of yesterday. They're pretty visible folks, so it's tough. And I would say, the president, President Trump, has gotten some grief for this, but I would say he has worked very hard on this and has done virtually everything he could to try to get this done. The blame is on the Congress, not the president, as far as I'm concerned.
And do you see that the president and the speaker on the same page, moving in the same direction to get this done?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of stories about trouble there. They're working together now. The election was something different when you have a lot of candidates, but I think at this point they're working very well as a team.
Speaking of the president, last week he unveiled his tax reform plan. What are your thoughts on it? And that's, some people say that actually could be harder than getting health care through. What do you think the prospects are of moving it maybe before the August recess?
Well, I think we have to get the health care done first and then tax reform. That was the plan all along. And obviously one of the reasons for that is you've got $900 billion of savings in the health care that's going to then be used to some degree in the tax cuts to make that possible. So that's important, not absolutely critical, but I think pretty important. Now, as far as the president's plan, you've really got several plans out there. You obviously got the one that the president released recently. You've got the Better Way that Paul Ryan and the House worked on last year. You've got You've got Kevin Brady, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which is very similar, although more evolved than the Better Way was. So you've got several different plans, and hopefully the Democrats will step up and offer ideas which can be considered and maybe actually acted upon. But we'll see. You know, you'd like to see bipartisanship in this place, but doesn't happen very often.
It can be tough. As far as going back to regulations, are you, as you know, some Obama-era regulations have been eradicated under this new administration. The Congress has acted. Are you in the process of identifying more to get rid of?
We are, although we obviously up to this point, in the ones that regulations that were enacted in the last couple of months of the Obama administration, the time has kind of lapsed on that.
Right,
so
through the CRA.
Some of the low-hanging fruit was already acted upon. But I think all the committees and all members, really on both sides of the aisle, ought to look on what really just mucks up the system right now. What is out there that's affecting American businesses and individuals as well. A lot of regulations actually affect individuals directly, but it tends to be more businesses, and especially small businesses. So it's something we ought to be working together on. We are now. Every committee is doing that, because if you're going to, every new regulation you have, you're going to get rid of 2 regulations. That's a lot of red tape to get rid of. So there's a great opportunity, I think, there. And I think those regulations have been like a wet blanket on this economy. That's one reason that growth, which you really need if you're going to create more jobs in this country and more opportunity and prosperity, you need to get rid of those regulations in order to get that growth up from, you know, kind of an anemic 1.5% up to at least 3%. That's the goal.
And that growth could help pay for tax reform.
Exactly.
That's the plan.
That's exactly right. And that's why dynamic scoring is so important, that you know, you don't lose $1. Washington can't spend $1 less for every dollar of taxes that you cut. If you reduce taxes, you allow people to spend that money, that is good for the economy, and so it grows the economy. It may not be dollar for dollar. In fact, I would say it's not dollar for dollar, but it's something in between there. And so dynamic scoring is important, and realizing that if you reform the tax code and you reduce taxes, you are going to reinvigorate the economy and create more jobs in this country.
Speaking of deadlines, the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, was here last week, and he said, you know, the Congress has to raise the debt ceiling, and he says it's not going to be done at the last second, so which we'll see. We'll see about that. How important is for certainty that there's not a massive fight like we've seen in the past in 2011 with other types of fiscal cliffs and battles over the debt ceiling to come to an agreement so that it doesn't come down to the last second?
Yeah, it would be nice not to have that fight, but we usually do.
Right.
So there'll be some fight. I just don't know when ultimately it'll be resolved. But I think most people on both sides are committed to resolving it at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we're in Washington, so you never know.
Right. Republicans say the Democrats always talk about raising the minimum wage in an even-numbered year. They talk about it more than the odd-number year. Where do you stand on raising the minimum wage? Do you think this is a situation where it should be done, maybe not as high as where some Democrats want it? And is it difficult to, in the PR battle, explain what the minimum wage could do, as Republicans say, would lose, and CBO has come up with some estimates of job losses if you raise the minimum wage.
Well, as chairman of the Small Business Committee, it's something that I care about a lot, because what doesn't get told too often is when you artificially raise the minimum wage, whether it's $15 an hour, as some cities are doing, or whatever it is, you're oftentimes cutting off people at the entry level. And oftentimes those are young people, people trying to get their first job. And those folks oftentimes don't get in the workforce as a result of wages being artificially higher than they can justify, that they bring to a business. So that's my concern about artificially. In other words, when I say artificial, I mean the government doing it rather than it happening naturally through the market as it should happen. And if we're going to raise minimum wages, I personally think that ought to be done at the state level and not by the federal government. Wages in rural Mississippi are and ought to be different than they are in downtown Manhattan. But right now, the federal government determines what minimum wages are, and I think that's wrong, and it messes up the economy.
In talking to Senator Shaheen, she voted for the SBA head, Linda McMahon, and that vote was actually pretty bipartisan, one of the more bipartisan votes we've seen.
It was.
81 to 19. What do you think, where's she going to bring the SBA? Do you talk to her a lot? And what do you think her reign will do for small business?
I think she's going to be great. We've been in touch since the nomination occurred, and she testified before the committee just a couple of weeks ago. She's very prepared, I believe, for this job. She understands this because she's been a small business person and then grew that into a larger business, and so knows what you have to do. Yeah, quite big, yeah. So I think she's going to be very good. She's now, the SBA, it's a department, it's been around a while. It was actually created the same year I was, 1953. It needs to improve. It tends to be a fairly bureaucratic agency where there's a lot of good that it can do, and it does a lot of good, but it could do a lot better. I talk to small businesses all over the country, and what the complaints that I hear is they'll enter into the process, they hear about loans, and they need one. And by the time they wade through all the paperwork, and the SBA loses their papers, and it takes a while, oftentimes they just give up. And so we need to improve that whole process, whether it's the 7A loans or the 8A loan program, a 504 loan program. There's a lot of reform that needs to happen there. And I think President Trump made a great choice in Linda McMahon, and we're looking forward to those reforms happening.
8 years of President Obama, SBA, other policies I know you've been a critic of Obamacare and regulations, but how was SBA under the Obama administration? Did they not have enough power in that administration?
I mean, they tried, and I worked with them very closely. I've been the ranking member of that committee and now the chair, and I have to say, the ranking member, Nydia Velasquez, who also was chair, she and I have a very good working relationship, and it is one of the committees that really does work in a bipartisan manner. And the administration tried. We tried to offer things and recommendations, and sometimes they did pretty well and sometimes not. But we're looking for improvements there.
What is, when you're outside the Washington Beltway in your district in Cincinnati, what are you hearing that Washington doesn't quite get?
Well, what I hear is you're not getting much done. That's what I hear a lot. And they don't like all the fighting. You guys seem to fight all the time, and why can't you work together? And now at this point, let me talk about just from a more conservative Republican perspective. I mean, we have the House, we have the Senate, we have the presidency. Soon the Supreme Court will probably tilt more in that direction. Yep. There's no excuses as far as I'm concerned. And when I explain to them, and the principal reason that things don't necessarily get done is because of the Senate. It's all their fault. No, it's the 60 vote rule over there that stops everything from happening. And when you start explaining that, when you're explaining, you're losing, as they say. Right. But that is the problem. I'd love to see that reformed both ways. Now I understand Republicans are there now, and they may be in the minority later, and so that, it switches sides in one's point of view. But that's something as an institution and as a nation I think we need to change. It's not. It's not embedded in the Constitution. It's something that we've had for a century or so in various forms, but it wasn't always there. And I think it just gums up the works, and that's the principal reason why nothing gets done in Washington. Now things get done. We pass CRs, we pass omnibus bills but the American people deserve, like I said about Obamacare, they deserve a lot better than they're getting out of Washington. So that's the disgruntlement of the American people right now. I think it's justified because they look at Washington, they pay our salaries, they send a lot of their tax dollars up here, and they think that it's just kind of a black hole where not much progress gets made, and a lot of that's true.
And President Trump has indicated that he would also like the filibuster rules in the Senate to change. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, not as fond of that idea. But is that opinion of changing the rules of the Senate, do you think that that's going to build momentum, and do most House Republicans want that? from what you sense?
Let me answer the second one for yes.
Okay.
That most House Republicans want it. Now, is it actually going to happen? Obviously, McConnell came out and said yesterday it's not going to happen. I think if there was enough attention focused on this, that really is the problem, maybe there could be some change over in the Senate. That may, I'm a House guy, so in the Senate it's obviously very different, and they'd say, you just don't understand, and pat me on the head. But that is the problem. That is the principal problem why progress in either direction doesn't happen. Now, then they'll argue, well, the founders had in mind, you had King George, and don't you understand that that's opposition to tyranny that we're all about?
They go back to King George. That's
They do.
A while back.
They do.
Wow.
So.
We're approaching the Q&A from the audience, so if you have some questions, please think of them and identify yourself. Speaker Ryan has said, just going back to that Republicans have been disappointed in the first 100 days, but he's also said, hey, judge, and he said this early on, as McConnell did, judge us not on 100 days, but on 200 days, because what we're trying to do, they're heavy lifts. Tax reform hasn't been done since 1986. Healthcare has been difficult. Where do you see the party? Speaker Ryan has said, we've gone from an opposition party to a governing party, and kind of explaining some of why healthcare hasn't gotten done.
Yeah.
And do you see that transition happening, or is it going to take a little more time?
It hasn't happened yet. I hope it does take a little more time, and that's the only problem. But Republicans are divided in the House. You've got the Freedom Caucus, which is generally pretty dug in. Now, they did ultimately, after, they'll argue with this, they didn't stop the bill. It was the Tuesday group. Well, they were principally, I think, involved in that. There were some Tuesday folks, too. But they were pretty dug in. And then you've got our Tuesday group, which is more moderate. And then you've got the bulk of us on the RSC, Republican Study Committee, that's more in the middle. And we haven't shown yet that we can work together very well when it really matters. And on repealing and replacing Obamacare, it really does matter. I mean, we made a commitment, and it needs to get done, and we're not there yet. I'd like to say I'm cautiously optimistic that we will get there. That would be too optimistic. I'm hopeful. That would probably be more accurate.
Questions from the audience up front here? Hold on for the mic.
Dana Chasen, and I thought I'd get back to the matter at hand of Main Street and credit availability. And I just wondered if you could offer your perspective on credit availability for small businesses, and specifically the problem of competition for credit, where a small business might actually be willing to take credit on terms that are not all that favorable, maybe not predatory, but not favorable, and there are people who might not extend credit to a small business that's doesn't have a track record. Where do you see that tension playing out?
Well, access to capital or credit availability, as you talked about, is very, very critical. It's one of the biggest things that we work on and study in the Small Business Committee. And I would argue that one of the big problems is Dodd-Frank, which was a reaction, and it's understandable when we had the economic meltdown and the Great Recession. We needed to do something, and what they chose to do was to pass Dodd-Frank, which was supposed to affect the so-called too big to fail banks, but has actually affected community banks and credit unions and a whole range of folks who are the principal folks that small businesses borrow money from. And so if we can fix that, and Chairman Hensarling and others on Financial Services Committee have been working on the Choice Act, and things of that nature, I think that would be a way that we could deal with the lack of credit availability out there, and especially to small business folks. And when you're starting up a small business, they'll put it on their credit card, they'll borrow from relatives, but it's tough to get a loan. And then if you're going to expand, that's tough too. And we're actually, today in the Small Business Committee, a little bit later, we have a hearing on business accelerators, which tries to get folks from small businesses, mentorship with bigger companies, and to try to get them to the next level and to get more job growth. And so there's a whole range of things that we can do, but it's a very important point you raised.
Right up here.
Hi, Congressman.
Hi.
My name is Maya Rockymore. I am a 12-year owner of a small business.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. We want to attract the best workers. And so with that, we have to offer health care. We have to offer a 401k so that we can be competitive with others. But I've got to tell you that the paperwork that's required to upkeep all of the health care benefits and all of the retirement benefits is a lot on a small business.
Yep.
So I've got to ask you this, and I'm just curious. It just seems to me that if we're concerned about productivity and growth, that we should take the burden off of small businesses to have to maintain these systems. And it seems to me that an investment in healthcare by the federal government would be a way to actually do that. And it should be seen as a precondition, a necessary precondition to support the health of American workers who are driving that productivity and growth. So my question for you is, why are not Republicans interested in advancing universal health care as a fundamental right that allows the burden to be taken off of small businesses?
Okay. Well, we think the American people deserve better than what universal health care would deliver here or has delivered in other countries. We do think everybody ought to have access to quality, affordable health care. But the question is the government the most efficient way of producing that? And if you look at the results before Obamacare and after Obamacare, and you poll most people don't like it, especially small businesses. So that's where I just think we want the same thing, but there's a different way to get there. And you also raised, in your first part of your question, you talked about the burden of the paperwork on small businesses and how tough it is. One point I'd like to make, I've got, let me mention a couple of corporations, Procter & Gamble, GE Aviation, Macy's, Kroger's, great corporations. They all happen to be headquartered in my district. I love those great corporations, but small businesses are the backbone of the economy. P&G, if we pass new regulations up, or whether it's Congress or some bureaucratic agency, they can hire another accountant or another lawyer, and it doesn't affect them all that much. But to a small business person like yourself, that can be whether you're profitable or not. So, and a lot of that comes right out of this city, out of Washington. That's why we need to relieve the overburden of regulatory, the regulatory things that come out of Washington.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Eileen Schleff. I have my company's Creative Alliance Communications.
Hello.
I did find some things to agree with you on, which is why I'm speaking. I came here to work under Robert Kennedy, so that'll give you a sense of, I've seen it all. I also worked at Chase Investment Banking. So I'm speaking because after a career in corporate, federal, and state government, I'm working on the ground with nonprofits. But I will say to you, number one, before you do the 2-for-1 regulations, under Bush, I had no health insurance. I 90% lost my apartment and fought to keep it because of what happened under the recession. Some of the regulations protected us. Mm-hmm. So I ask you to think clearly before you throw things out the window. But I work with nonprofits that are doing workforce development. Every time they get a model to prepare people, the budget gets cut. We went on the Hill to talk about the relationship to higher ed, community education, and technology. Is there any way to start looking at these as cohesive instead of in silos and prepare a workforce that can take the jobs?
Yeah, we absolutely need a workforce that's ready. And this is something that, again, I hear from small business folks. If you're a small manufacturer, you're having a heck of a time finding qualified people to work for you anymore. They have to get, there are a number of things. They can't get people that'll actually come in to interview to begin with, and if they do, and they hire somebody, too often they don't show up for work on time, and they can't pass a drug test. So there's a whole range of problems that are out there that we have to deal with. We're educating people. There's nothing wrong with degrees in fine arts, and I'm a history major myself, and a whole range of other things. But right now, is that the best job in this workforce? It is for some people, but we've got to make sure that some people are in vocational education and that we have parents that are out there knowing what's available to them. I think you wanted to follow up. I must have said something you didn't like. Yeah.
I'm saying to you, workforce development is preparing people, and every time they develop a model, which they are working with corporate America on the model, they get budget cuts.
Yeah.
They are tied to community college unions, et cetera. We have 20, and one of my projects is 28 partners. They keep getting budget cuts. Then I go to a technology that's brilliant and could be some of those could be transferred to the workforce development. So all I'm saying is, why are all these budgets being done in silo when cross-platform is the only way for the future? Not a degree in software, I'm talking about really good skills, because we work with corporate America and find out what they need.
Yeah. Well, we do need, clearly, there are programs that work and a lot that don't. But, you know, why do budgets get cut and all that kind of stuff? I mean, we got a $20 trillion debt hanging over our heads, so you have to be very careful in your decisions. And the appropriations process is a total mess. And that's one of the problems. You have all kinds of things you get done, and the appropriations committees work very hard to get just the right things in there. And then because we can't get 60 votes over in the Senate, the whole thing gets thrown out, and you get some giant omnibus bill, and funding may be in there or it may not be in there, and nobody's had time to read the bill. So Washington really, and Congress is broken. It's dysfunctional. It doesn't work right. And that's the way some programs that probably shouldn't be funded get funded, and some, like workforce development programs, don't necessarily get funded. That's about the best I can do on that one.
We have run out of time. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much.
thank you
Please
very
thank the
much,
chairman.
Bob.
I'll hand it over to Johanna.